Good afternoon and welcome to LBMA webinars. We're delighted you could join us for an additional webinar. Joining me today are Ruth Crowell, LBMA's Chief Executive, and Benjamin Nénot, Principal at Synergy Global. If you have any questions, please submit these in the Q&A panel of your screen at the bottom. We will aim to answer these towards the end of the webinar. On today's webinar, we will be talking more about the Refiners Disclosure Guidance, which has been developed with the support of responsible sourcing experts, Synergy Global. Before we take a look at this document in more detail, I'd like to hand over to Ruth, who will say a few words about the importance of transparency.
Okay, thank you, Susannah, and thank you, Benjamin, for joining us this evening, this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. If we can go to the next slide, because I think it brings up our strategy. One thing I just wanted to say is why we're doing all this. Why does transparency matter? Ultimately, it's about building trust and upholding confidence. And you do that by being transparent and being open to questions. We've tried to lead by example by putting out our report in September this year, which talks about the LBMA program, its successes, as well as its challenges, and where we're aiming to go in the future. Now it's a turn of the refiners to look to do the same. So to speak up about their management systems, what they're doing, where they're sourcing from, and to address questions as they arise. Now, that's a lot easier said than done. And we know that. So one of the real goals of this framework that's been developed is to help refiners do that and to talk about what is expected and where we can help work together to bring that forward. Ultimately, it's also about speaking to non-audit professionals and speaking in clear language so that people can understand what the intention is, that the industry takes these issues seriously, and how they're looking to address challenges. So we're hoping that this guidance helps you get there, but as always, we're open to feedback as well as suggestions on how we can continuously improve. I think with that, I'll hand it back to Susannah, but I'll be around for the Q&A and we can talk about it more. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. As Ruth has just highlighted, transparency has been an absolute priority for 2020 and will continue to be so in the future. It is one of the 5 focus areas of our responsible sourcing strategy. The work we have been doing on the Refiner Disclosure Guidance is a key deliverable of this focus area. Next slide, please. The disclosure framework we have developed sets out 3 components that good delivery refiners should implement to meet the overall expectations of LBMA's responsible sourcing guidance. So breaking this down, first is the Refiners Compliance Report, which is a mandatory deliverable to comply with the annual Step 5 requirements. It is also the main focus of the disclosure guidance document and the webinar today. Second is a component on ongoing disclosure, encouraging refiners to take a proactive approach to disclosure. There is a section on this in the guidance document, and I'll say a few words about it later. Finally, we're proposing a new element that we've termed the Public Interest Report. This would primarily be aimed at stakeholders who would not typically read a more technical compliance report. We won't be going into this element any further on today's webinar as it is still under development. So for now, we're simply signposting the direction of travel. Next slide, please. I'd like just to build on Ruth's opening comments and elaborate on the need for the disclosure guidance document. So the disclosure guidance really helps LBMA to further address some of the recommendations made in the original OECD alignment assessment of the Responsible Gold Guidance. This is particularly pertinent as LBMA is currently undergoing a similar assessment as part of our application for industry recognition against the EU conflict minerals regulation. And also with the full transition to the ISAE standard this year, we saw a need to take a deep dive into the Step 5 requirements of the Responsible Sourcing Guidance to better articulate what is expected of refiners. I'll now hand over to Ben, who has been leading the development of this guidance document on behalf of Synergy. Ben is going to talk you through the process of how we got to this point, so effectively the methodology, but he's also going to provide a high-level overview of the document itself. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Susannah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Nénot. I've been leading this work for Synergy on behalf of the LBMA to work on the state of disclosure within good delivery list refiners and on elaborating the related disclosure guidance document that I'll present today. So let me perhaps start with a few words on the assessment that we've been conducting before starting to work on the disclosure document. So the objective of this assessment of the disclosure by good delivery list precious metal refiners were mostly to, first of all, better understand stakeholders' demands with regards to disclosure, what their expectations were. Also to identify the specific gaps in good delivery list refiners disclosure practices against the LBMA and the OECD standards, and therefore to lay the foundations for development of a standalone disclosure guidance document that I'll talk to later. So let's perhaps start with the methodology we've been using to conduct this assessment. So we've been reviewing obviously the relevant standards, the RGG and RSG versions 7 and 8, the third-party audit guidance. We've reviewed additional documentation and on reporting and disclosure guidelines suggested by the LBMA. And we've also had a look at other industries' disclosure practices. We've been using more specifically a sample of good delivery list refiners disclosure documents. So there were 16 refiners in our sample, and we've been looking, so those refiners were geographically diverse, but also dealing with gold and silver of different size and with different business models. We've also been looking at disclosure practices, both related to ISO and ISAE auditing standards to try and have a representative sample of reference. So we've been looking at the annual compliance reports, the related management reports, assurance statements by auditors, but also sustainability reports and the wider communications as part of for instance, the website publications. We've also had engagement with stakeholders. We've been discussing with the relevant teams at the OECD, but also to both issue-specific NGOs and more broad NGOs, as well as downstream actors such as RMI and the RGT. So moving now on to the findings of this research. Let's perhaps have a quick say a few words on the expectations that were raised by stakeholders. So first of all, there's been I mean, stakeholders have generally raised a lack of proactive communication by refiners on risk identification and management, mentioning that information on risks reported by refiners were generally not qualitative or specific enough. I think the quote that is appearing on the slide is quite revealing in this regard. So that's a quote that was provided by one of the stakeholders interviewed during the process. Stakeholders have also expressed concerns as to the fact that corrective action plans were not publicly disclosed when refiners have some degree of non-compliance. And more generally on supply chain disclosure and minerals origin, the perception of several stakeholders is that refiners do not provide enough information about gold origin, at least publicly, and some stakeholders have also raised that data about gold shouldn't be limited to country of origin, but also include country of trade and transit. And another important feedback that we got was that more disclosure was needed as to the type of material sourced by refiners. So some stakeholders pointing out to the fact that there is no distinction currently in the disclosure between bullion bar gold and jewelry for recycled gold. And that the LBMA could encourage refiners to go beyond the recycled and mined categories. So these were really the main feedbacks received during this consultation. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the key findings of our assessment. So at the very basic level, it was interesting to note that only 63% of refiners actually have a human rights policy, a human rights supply chain policy or precious metals procurement policy that is available online. So not saying that only 63% have one, it's only 63% that have one that is online. Despite this being the very first step of disclosure on due diligence aspects. But yet, it was also interesting to note that the compliance report do not necessarily reflect the reality of refiners' performance on disclosure. For instance, 88% of refiners declare to be fully compliant in all 5 OECD steps, whereas only, as I just said, only 63% actually had the supply chain policy publicly available. Supply chain policies often didn't extend to ESG responsibilities as required by the Responsible Gold Guidance, and was either not or vaguely referring to all OECD Annex 2 risks. But also, for looking at another criteria of disclosure, which is around disclosure about the grievance mechanism, only 25% of refiners have a grievance mechanism or whistleblowing policy that was publicly available at that time. And some refiners do not mention at all the existence of a grievance mechanism in their compliance report. Now, as to the refiners' disclosure on supply chain risk identification and risk assessment, which is the step 2 of the Responsible Gold Guidance and the Responsible Silver Guidance, the main assessment findings were that the information included in refiners' compliance report was generally too general with respect to supply chain risks, not specifying the type of risks that are encountered by the refiner in its supply chain. Refiners also do not disclose generally their process to define high-risk supply chain and or conflict-affected and high-risk areas. So we found that only 19% of refiners explicitly state in their reporting that they source transport gold, whether it be mined or recycled, from high-risk areas or suppliers. So on high-risk sources, more generally, although some refiners provide general information on site visits, no specific information is provided by refiners on, for instance, the number of site visits, the dates, the findings, the countries or the regions where they carried out those visits, and more generally, any due diligence process or information on risk that would go beyond the tier 1 supplier. So that was also an important finding, that actually no refiner disclosed its process to define what's the definition of OCARA, of a conflict-affected and high-risk area according to them. So generally, same comments about how refiners communicate on risk management. The feedback received were along the same lines, that information was too general and not giving sufficient information on the actual risks faced by the refiners. Beyond strict compliance, maybe just a word on sustainability considerations. So the LBMA asked us also to look at wider public disclosure by refiners as to environmental and social considerations. And an interesting finding of this part of the research has been that only a small portion of refiners are actually at specific press releases on sustainability or responsible sourcing matters. And that is 31%, showing that there was some room for improvement in terms of refiners' general wider ad hoc disclosure. So as part of our research, we've also identified, next slide please, good practices in refiners' disclosure. Some refiners publicly reporting on country of origin data, for instance, as well as on transit area that could be considered high risk. Some refiners also publicly report on their sourcing from ISM, which I think should be noted, especially because it's been a real improvement over the last years, and also on specific roles and responsibilities within the organization as to the management of grievances. I guess the conclusion on this is it was quite clear from the research that not all refiners disclose about responsible sourcing to the same extent, and some of them produce periodic informative and good press releases on responsible sourcing. So that this had also to be noted. So in terms of areas for improvements that we could identify, next slide, please. The main conclusions from this research were that there are areas for improvement, mainly in terms of compliance with the requirements of the responsible sourcing guidance. But more generally, a need for greater alignment with the OECD's 5-step framework, particularly in terms of annual disclosure of challenges, identified risk and mitigation plans, but also for this information to be measured and for the performance to be assessed over time. So that was also an important finding. More generally, in terms of the consistency of reporting, we found out that there was a room for improvement in terms of consistency of audit deliverables. So between the management reports and the compliance reports, there was sometimes inconsistency. And more specifically, the non-conformances that were identified were not very clearly outlined in the audit deliverables. So that was another important area for improvement. So I'll now go more in detail through these points when presenting the disclosure guidance, which is the response to those conclusions. So maybe a few words on the purpose of this guidance. So it's been developed, first of all, to support good delivery list refiners in implementing the step 5 of the responsible sourcing guidance, which talk to the disclosure requirements. And while it also provides greater alignment with the OECD guidance step 5 requirements on public annual reporting, it also goes beyond this with the aim to encourage more open and robust communication by refiners that would help generate more confidence in the industry and with the external stakeholders more generally. So this is really the purpose of this document. Maybe in terms of application, we should start by saying that the primary audience of this guidance, next slide please, the primary audience of this guidance document is the good delivery list refiners, obviously, but it can also serve as a reference point for other refiners seeking to be aligned with the responsible sourcing program and OECD requirements, more generally speaking. Maybe a word on proportionate application, because that's an important point of the OECD guidance, and that applies to this guidance. Each refiner would be expected to apply this guidance proportionally to their business activities and to those directly involved in precious metal supply chains. However, proportionate application doesn't mean different standards for different institutions. It is a recognition of the different levels of size, complexity, nature of engagement, and sophistication of precious metal producers and refiners, as well as exposure to supply chain risks. So the guidance has been defined to be flexible enough to adapt to these different contexts and risk exposure of refiners. Next slide, please. So in terms of maybe to start with, I mean, before presenting the guidance in a bit more details, a quick look at its outline. So the disclosure guidance will follow the 5 steps of the responsible God guidance. It follows the 5 steps from company management system to reporting. And I'd like to emphasize on the fact that no additional topic or process is to be covered or disclosed than the ones that were already present in the responsible God guidance. It is also important to note that the expected disclosure output remains the audit compliance report, as Susannah mentioned before. There is no additional reporting requirement apart from expanding current ones. Next slide, please. So in terms of the overview of the disclosure guidance, first of all, it clarifies the LBMA existing disclosure requirements that are consistent with the OECD expectations. But it also requires more specific disclosure on some aspects of due diligence and responsible sourcing. That includes due diligence organization. So it specifies what types of the requirements in terms of disclosure for describing the organization on due diligence, but also the traceability systems in place. And it provides also criteria. It requires disclosure of criteria used to determine a conflict-affected and high-risk area or high-risk supplier. And above all, it requires more specific disclosure on the actual supply chain risks and how they're being managed by the refiner. And therefore should address the expectations from the OECD, from external stakeholders, but also of regulatory requirements existing or upcoming. Next slide, please. So the main objective of this guidance is to provide more specific guidance on disclosure. So the structure we've been following is really the 5 steps. So we've been trying to provide very specific guidance and criteria against each step of the responsible God guidance. So specific criteria are provided for each step, and there is also we also wanted to possibly address questions that refiners might have on those criteria. So we do provide those criteria, but I think it's also important to say that because we're talking about disclosure, the criteria we provide can't necessarily be considered as KPIs. When we talk about disclosure and transparency, it is, not all practices are comparable or quantifiable. Therefore, due diligence on risk is a qualitative process, and we haven't been able necessarily to define quantitative metrics for each step and each criteria. Next slide, please. We've also been providing specific insights as to potential questions that refiners might have on some of those requirements. So we've been using examples in the industry, also in other industries where we found interesting examples, interesting ways to disclose, taking into account the business sensitivities and confidentiality constraints. So yes, for each step, we've been willing to provide as detailed criteria as possible, still being aware that we are talking about a qualitative matter that is not that can't be dealt with the same way by everyone. So this is to be taken into account. Next slide, please. Maybe the last important point that the disclosure guidance aims at addressing is that the disclosure through the compliance report is an audit subject matter. So maybe important to note as well that related requirements, disclosure requirements, were presented and addressed in the recent auditors training that we've had in the industry, and so all auditors have been informed and trained on how to look at those disclosure requirements. It's worth noting too that this update will be reflected in an upcoming iteration of the LBMA third-party audit guidance, as well as the responsible God guidance. Finally, this guidance seeks to produce greater consistency and alignment of reporting in audit deliverables. That was an expectation raised by stakeholders interviewed as part of this assessment. And so it's important to understand that it is not all about improving the content, but also the consistency and coherence of the information that is produced. So basically to make sure that the audit outputs are consistent with each other between the management report, the assurance statement, and the compliance report. So that was also part of the objective. So I think that that was it in terms of the key aspects and content of the disclosure guidance, and I will now hand over back to Susannah.
Thanks, Ben. So I just want to say a word onto the next slide, please. about another section that has been included in the guidance that isn't strictly compliance, it's almost beyond compliance. So if we think about the Step 5 Refiners Compliance Report as annual reporting on the past, ongoing disclosure is about the present. It's about adopting a proactive approach to disclosure rather than reactive communication with regards to potential risks in the supply chain. So in this section, we included recommendations and principles to guide refiners on enhancing their due diligence disclosure. We've also included tips to support refiners on how to respond to responsible sourcing related incidents should they arise. And this is really in response to our experience over the past few years in terms of, unfortunately, we all are aware that incidents arise, and sometimes refiners, rightly or wrongly, find themselves at the forefront of those, the spotlight. And we often support them and encourage them to engage with the issue and proactively respond. But what we're trying to do here is really get ahead of that and provide them with that guidance on how to do so up front, so that they understand exactly what we expect of them and what wider stakeholders do. And the rationale behind this is really because of course, LBMA is there to represent the good delivery list and support where necessary. But we always encourage refiners to be in control of their own narrative and to build trust with their stakeholders by openly engaging with those issues. So on to the next slide, please. So in summary, just going back, just really laying it out there in terms of what all of you must be thinking, sort of what's expected of you. So what we did with this website, with this webinar, is really give you a taste of what's to come. We wanted to raise the awareness, make sure it's on your radar. We have been talking about the fact that this disclosure guidance was coming. We had plans to launch it earlier in the year, but due to the impact of COVID, we felt that there was enough going on. So we wanted to make sure that it came to a time when, refiners had caught up with the incidents that they were sort of dealing with in terms of COVID and could dedicate the right attention. So that's why we're due to launch it now. But practically speaking, what does it mean? It means that the intention is for the disclosure guidance to inform the next round of compliance reports. So think of it as 2020 is the year of implementation, but the disclosure guidance will actually become mandatory in 2022 with the launch of the version 9 responsible sourcing guidance. So the responsible goal guidance will be undergoing consultation and will be launched. And once that's launched, that's when the guidance will become mandatory. So that really gives you a year to understand how to implement it. It also gives you a year to provide us with feedback. So we will be sharing the document by the end of before year end, but this is definitely not a done deal, and we do welcome feedback. A point about the other elements of the framework, if you like. The element of ongoing disclosure, of course, remains at refiners' discretion. However, as I said previously, we really do encourage this approach, and we do find that if done in the right way, it always serves to the refiners and the industry's benefit. But again, we are always open to discussing that further with you. And finally, we've included an appendix on the public interest report in the guidance document. And that's really to start to give you an understanding of the direction of travel. So to be clear, the public interest report is not a mandatory deliverable in 2021. It is still under further development, and we will be consulting on it further in due course. So for 2021, the focus for our refiner is to take meaningful steps to improve the quality of your disclosure through the annual compliance report, using the disclosure guidance as a tool to support you. So I now hand back to Ruth, who will be facilitating the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Susannah, and thank you, Benjamin. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of work going into getting this framework together, and I think thanks as well to the refiners who gave feedback, as well as the other stakeholders. We had a couple of questions that came in before we began, and it's a bit asking about, I think as always, we had feedback too with the report that we put out in September. Why can't we have mine by mine information of exactly where this metal is coming from and going to, and explaining that there's a lot of commercial sensitivities in that information, which is why we took the rule as we apply to trade reporting data, in that there has to be at least 3 refiners present in a country to show the area of the country of destination. And we did that for 5 countries. Now, refiners can obviously take the view that they can say more, but it's also just to explain to other stakeholders that there can be challenges from a commercial perspective in doing so. But I think the simple message is really to try to be as transparent as you can. And if there are any feedback from refiners as you go through this year of implementation, for us, for the guidance, we would really appreciate it. And the same goes for our own statements that we'll be putting out. We're looking to work collaboratively and collectively as an industry to approach this. So we certainly will continue to improve our approach from LBMA on transparency. The other question that came through was just about how is the material defined in terms of why are we saying by country as opposed to by mine site? We follow very much the OECD definitions in terms of the types of gold. So this is large scale mining, artisanal mining, recycled gold. And there are specific recommendations in terms of what the origin of that material is. For mined gold, obviously the country where it was mined, but when it comes to recycled and grandfathered, there's more specifications there. So that's why it's approached in that way. It's really being consistent with standards. Otherwise, there's a couple questions coming through, and we're happy to take them afterwards as well. So I think in terms of questions about the auditors and how they're disclosing, I think ultimately the auditor function is there to check the accuracy of statements made by refiners, but it is the refiner's statement that is being made. So fundamentally, it is down to the refiner to be responsible, but we're just looking to make sure that you can have consistency there. In terms of the LBMA providing a definitive list, this has been a question that has been ongoing since 2010, and I'm afraid no is the answer to it. There are, I think there's good progress with the EU conflict minerals legislation to give more definitive steer in terms of what can be considered conflict effective and high risk areas, because that's a consistent point when you're trying to have an approach that is consistent across an industry is how are people rating areas and countries. And there's a lot of publicly available tools, and I believe more forthcoming with the legislation that comes into effect on the 1st of January. I don't know, Benjamin or Susannah, if there's any other points you want to raise in relation to some of those questions that have come up, or anything further.
Maybe one point from my side as to the question on the list of conflict-affected and high-risk areas. I think it's important to realize that this expectation is for companies to own the definition process, because the level of risk is not the same for everyone from all countries, depending on their supply chains, the material they're dealing with. So I don't think one should expect such a thing, actually, because the requirement is for companies to make their own definition according to their own supply chains and appreciation of risk. So that would actually be quite opposed to the spirit of responsible sourcing.
Yeah, it was definitely a point that was debated when writing the gold supplement, for example, at quite a lot of length, but ultimately the requirement was put squarely on the companies. But I do recognize the challenge with that. Susannah, is there anything else you wanted to raise? I'm conscious with the ongoing
Yes.
You know, that's a point that we're trying to work on too. We've done our annual reporting, but it is about how we respond to things during the year, not just putting out a report once a year.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I actually wanted to go back to the point about the auditors, because it is actually Synergy who ran the training for auditors. Ben was one of the main facilitators. And for everyone on this webinar today, we actually took about 120 auditors through that training. And we reflected on this guidance with the auditor. So I think it might be helpful. I know Ben touched upon it a little bit in his presentation, but maybe just so that the refiners on this webinar today can understand really what were the key messages you wanted to distill with those auditors regarding disclosure.
Thanks, Susannah. So yes, maybe two main things. One was really to tell auditors that the information in compliance report should reflect the nature of the company's due diligence. So that talks to their systems and the operationalization of the systems, but also in terms of issues and risks being faced by the company in their supply chains. So I think one key message was, as auditors, you need to make sure that somehow the compliance report reflects the nature of the company operations and the risks they face in their operations. So accuracy, transparency were important concepts. And then the other important concept was around consistency, making sure that what is in the compliance report actually reflects what is in the management report, so the report of auditors to the company, and making sure that this consistency also applies to non-conformances. So these were really the two key messages as to the audit disclosure interface, I would say.
Thanks.
And I think it's a really good point, Susannah, because I think that not everybody's aware, because it was the auditors who were the focus of that training, but some really excellent work, and we're grateful to Synergy as well as yourself in terms of the folks who took part in that, because it's partly, we do look to train auditors every year. We also do an annual review in terms of their listing as an approved service provider, but certainly it was much more in depth this year. And we've had some excellent feedback because we do need the auditors to be as informed as possible. There's another question that's come up, and this is about, I think, what we call the public interest report. Now, there is a compliance report that everyone is putting out, and there's specific recommendations that we've put in this framework to explain what's expected in those compliance reports, and that's about building trust. But I think that's also speaking to a community who is really on it when it comes to everything auditing, who are the expectations in terms of OECD frameworks, and it's really an informed audience. And I think it doesn't address the more public interest side. So the public interest report does not have to be a standalone report. I think many refiners who are doing a good job of this are weaving that into their sustainability reports in terms of overall messaging. So it's really about bringing the communications teams in to help with how do we get the message out on that. Because certainly the compliance report is something that from a compliance and a controls perspective, you're going to see, but how you communicate that is really a conversations with the comms team in terms of how do you make that real, and how do you make sure people trust that there's commitment to those principles and requirements. Otherwise, I think that's most of the questions we've had come through. I think from my side, it's been very thorough. Thank you, Susannah. Thank you, Benjamin. I don't know if you have any final statements you want to make for the group.
Yes, I'd just like to thank Synergy for the work they've put in. I'd also like to say, and I believe perhaps I didn't highlight this, that this document was shared with the Refiners Committee. And we are just in the process of finalizing some of their comments. It was also shared with the OECD, who gave very positive feedback in terms of its alignment with the OECD guidance and their expectations. And just a reminder, they are a key stakeholder in terms of this. So as we're just in the process of finalizing those few comments, and we will be sure to release that before year end. And of course, you will receive the communication about that as soon as we do. But we look forward to working with you on this next year. This is a collaborative effort. We remain open to questions and providing guidance as we always do. Thank you.
Thank you, Susannah. Thank you, Benjamin. And thank you to everyone who took part today.
Thank you.
I think you're on mute, Taylor.
I apologize for that. Thank you all again from me for joining. Just as some last minute housekeeping for you, if you do have any questions that perhaps you weren't able to ask now or that stem from this webinar in the days and weeks to come, please email us at ask@lbma.org.uk and we will try and answer your questions as best as possible or point you in the direction of somebody who can. And in terms of our upcoming webinars, so we have two final ones for the year 2020. We have our LBMA Asia update on the 3rd, so this coming Thursday. We have Sunil Kashyap from Scotiabank, Jeremy East, our Senior Advisor for Asia. We've got Nicholas Verpel from ABC Bullion and Albert Cheng from SBMA. And then following that, our last webinar for the year on the 10th, we'll look at TMO and Brexit. So we've got, Her Majesty's Treasury, HMRC, and Deloitte kind of discussing that, the implications on the market that we will see. And again, if you have any ideas for speakers or tips, things you would like to see, you would like to know more about, please, again, email us at ask@lbma.org.uk. And with that, I offer you the final thank you of the webinar, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon and a lovely weekend. So that is that from us, and goodbye.